Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are, to everyone. This is Donald McEach, and I had the privilege of representing Virginia's 4th Congressional District. I want to welcome all of you all to this Zoom meeting. If Chairman Grijalva and I had our druthers, we would be out there in LA with you. But between COVID and now the wildfires that you all are suffering from, we are forced to do this through the magic of Zoom. But I want you all to know that you all are in our prayers and you are in our thoughts as you deal with the wildfires that are out there. And please know that the chairman and I are committed to working with you all to do everything in our power in Congress to ameliorate the impact of these fires, as well as to get to the root cause, which is, as we all know, the climate crisis. We're here today, obviously, to talk about environmental justice issues. Environmental justice is an issue that's near and dear to both of us. We have, for the past year and a half or so, tried our best to listen to EJ communities and to craft a bill that will give the EJ communities the power that they deserve to really be able to help themselves. You know, for far too long, EJ communities have been dictated to as to what the solutions ought to be, rather than being empowered to launch those, seek their own relief that they need for themselves and empowered for themselves. And so that's what the Environmental Justice for All Act does. I'm deeply ingrained in the chairman's debt for him allowing me to ride side saddle with him on this issue. It has been a joy working with him and working with all of you as we move forward on these environmental justice issues. We've got a great panel today that will be bringing you good thoughts and illuminating many issues for us. And I'm going to go now and introduce the panelists. I'm going to start with Yvette Lopez Letsema. And please help me out with the correct pronunciation of that last name, please, Yvette. Ledesma, forgive me. She is she is the Urban to Wild Director at the Wilderness Society. She and her team have worked in developing partnerships, policies, and programs to ensure equitable access to parks and open spaces in Los Angeles, Seattle, and Albuquerque. She currently serves on the San Fernando Valley Metro Service Council and is a commissioner on the City of Los Angeles North Valley Area Planning Commission. And we appreciate your participation today. We also have Mark Lopez. He is the co-director of the East Yard Communities for Environmental Justice. He comes from a family with a long history of activism. He's engaged in a wide array of student activism at UC Santa Cruz, where he earned his BA in Environmental Studies and taught university courses at UC Santa Cruz, Cal State Northridge, and UCLA Extension. We also have Megan Chichester. She is the Black Maternal Health Counselor for Black Women for Wellness in Los Angeles and a recent graduate of Occidental College. She holds a degree in urban and environmental policy and a minor in public health. Megan received distinction on her senior thesis, Maternal Health Coordination, How Community Health Centers and Maternal Mortality Review Committees Can Impact Black Maternal Health Outcomes. We thank all of you all for your participation. This should be a great panel. Mr. Chairman, I yield to you.
Thank you very much. And before I also welcome our panelists and thank them very much for their time and their expertise and point of views that we need. Let me also, I think our colleague from California has joined us as well, Mr. Lowenthal. If he has, Mr. Lowenthal, if the floor is open, if you would like to say a few words before the panelists begin. Alan?
No, I'm just really glad to be there in your leadership and Don's leadership. I think in my district, which is the Port District, I share with Congresswoman Barragon, environmental justice issues predominate. We have serious pollution issues, we have air quality issues, we have congestion. Everything runs through some of the communities that have the least amount of resources get the most amount of the pollution. So I'm just interested in being part of this. Thank you.
Thank you, my friend. And Mr. Lowenthal has been a key partner and an original co-sponsor of the Environmental Justice for All Act, a tool that we feel that EJ communities can use in the future, and a tool that we want to codify into law. And essentially, I think, as Mr. McEachin said, this was an effort that came from the community first. I had participated with other members 8-9 years ago in drafting an EJ bill. And then I wondered why we weren't getting, the groundswell of support that we should have from communities. Well, the answer was that, and it was told to me very directly, that those communities were not involved, that it was a top-down insistence on a piece of legislation without their participation. And so we reversed it. And over more than a year and a half, we had a summit where about 400 folk came to DC, many from California, to begin to craft a piece of legislation that would represent those interests as well. And so that after that, Representative McEachin, Senator Harris, and I introduced the Environmental Justice for All Act, created through this inclusive process, community-led, community-driven. And I think a bill that wouldn't exist without the consistent engagement of communities across this country. And the bill is essentially creates a new environmental justice grants under EPA. An important point, expands and strengthens the Civil Rights Act of 1964 by allowing residents to seek justice and redress through Title VI rights under the Civil Rights Act, the disparate treatment and discrimination issue. Strengthens the Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, by extending community commenting periods and an involvement of affected communities. An assistance fund is also created for a just transition, and it requires the consideration of cumulative impacts in permitting decisions under the Clean Waters Act and the Clean Air Act. Our success up to now has been dependent on the stakeholders, and in the momentum that we built for next Congress and for this Congress, the committee that I happen to have the privilege of chairing, the Resources Committee, will hold a legislative hearing on the bill at the end of this month, and we're asking all environmental justice communities across this country to submit their letters so that we be part of the record about how they feel and about the comprehensive environmental justice legislation that we will be talking about. We're going to hear directly today from Los Angeles. They will share with us the many challenges their communities face and how the passage of the Environmental Justice for All Act will give them a new tool to combat polluters. I would now, and there's been some movement, and Mr. McEachin and I and Mr. Lowenthal are very gratified. The select committee that was put together in Congress, in the House of Representatives, incorporated the entire EJ bill into the recommendations on how to deal with climate change and how to respond to that imminent crisis that the people in California are dealing with in a much more direct way. We also have seen the presidential candidate, the Biden-Harris ticket, incorporate many of the components of this legislation into their platform. We've also seen that with the upcoming energy bill, an effort on the part of leadership to incorporate many of the key components of this legislation into an energy bill. I mention all those things because I think that's the momentum that we need in order to have this piece of legislation become something real, something codified into law, and something signed by a president. So thank you. With that, let me turn it back over to my friend, Mr. McEachin, for the, I think Yvette Lopez Ledesma is the first speaker. Mr. McEachin, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Yvette, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Representative McEachin, Grijalva, and Lowenthal, and I'm glad to see you all doing well. I'm grateful to be able to share in this space with you all. And first of all, I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm speaking from the homelands of the Tongva peoples, more specifically here in the San Fernando Valley, the Tataviam peoples, and we honor and continue to uplift them as stewards of the land. And when I talk about parks, I make sure that we do that and acknowledge their history and the current presence still here on this land. And when speaking about parks in an urban context, we can't talk about parks without talking about urban planning. And so it has been that a history of violent land use planning and continued ill planning practices here in LA has created the conditions where according to the LA County Park Needs Assessment, 52% of neighborhoods in LA County are considered to be of high or very high park need. Neighborhoods where, here in LA were developed, for industry, and the people came later, right? People were an afterthought. So, neighborhoods were developed for industry to thrive and for people to deal with the consequences. And so for folks watching us from outside of LA, to put existing conditions into some context, nationally, the average ratio of park acres to people is said to be about 10 acres per 1,000. And in LA's environmental justice communities, neighborhoods where homes abut stationary sources of pollution, places like Boyle Heights, South Central, Panorama City, Pacoima, Sun Valley, we're hovering around about an acre of park space per 1,000. And so these majority brown and Black communities are densely populated areas with very limited park space that also are impacted by polluters from LADWP energy generating stations, one of which is currently silently leaking methane. And it has been doing so for over a year, to freeways, airports, diesel trucking routes, landfills, you name it, it's here. And despite, these environmental stressors, community members, need and deserve access to space to convene, break bread, walk, bike, do what they got to do, and have spaces that really do serve multiple benefits. And in LA, though, parks can definitely serve multiple benefits, particularly things around, climate mitigation, urban heat island effect, flooding that often occurs. You hear about drought, but you don't hear about the flooding that happens in our neighborhoods, in our places that have little, stormwater capture infrastructure that meets the needs of the communities that are there. And so, all of these spaces could also be spaces to recreate and to connect with natural elements. And I also wanted to just speak on just like the current pandemic, and the pandemic has really highlighted, not just highlighted, but exacerbated the inequities that exist when it comes to parks. Because folks are seeing that a park is not just a place with a playground and some grass. It's a resource hub. Yes, they primarily provide the benefits of a space to be active and find respite and enhance our quality of life. However, as we adapt to a changing environment and survive through this pandemic, a park is also a COVID testing site. It's a space for students to access Wi-Fi and a quiet space to do their work, and have some remote learning opportunities. It's a childcare site. It's a food pantry, and it's a place to socialize distantly. And so just also wanted to give a quick shout out to our LA County Department of Recreation and Parks, or Parks and Recreation, I should say, under the leadership of Norma Garcia. The department has even, as they're facing, possibility of really harsh budget cuts, has really come through and just gone all hands on deck to bring more resources into communities at this time across the 88 cities in LA. And so, we really see parks as being like the ultimate flexible public space right now in LA. And it's a shame that, again, I mentioned, 52% of the neighborhoods in LA don't have access to this resource right now. So, as climate keeps changing and communities lack sparse, communities that lack the park space exist, the impacts of health of millions will worsen. So there's real urgency in addressing this need while balancing needs such as housing, economic development, and mobility. In many of our local neighborhoods, organizations and individuals have been hard at work visioning and planning projects on disparate pockets of land that have for too long served as a barrier and not as a neighborhood asset. So from adjacent areas to flood control channels to vacant lots once occupied by pre-NAFTA industry. Community members want projects for them and buy them. And these are also the type of park projects that are less likely to result in things like green gentrification. But in order to make those a common practice in park development, we need to have dedicated funding resources, which are available through the Outdoor Recreation Legacy Program, which is included in the EJ for All Act. And in a place like LA, funding programs also need to take into consideration things like soil remediation and hold businesses accountable. Because they leave behind a mess. So while nothing beats having a safe access to a park down the street, many of the communities I mentioned are places with both the San Gabriel Mountains and the Santa Monica Mountains within view. And while the mountains make up 70% of the open space in LA County, they are not easily accessible. Particularly to people who do not have cars. And in LA, there are still individuals and families without cars. Don't believe the hype that everyone's driving around in a car. 13% of households, according to 2015 data, don't own cars. And also bus transit has been reduced. And so this means that in a county of 10 million people, somewhere over about a million people are left out to figure things out for themselves. And so people want to head out for a day outdoors, either on their own or with a family, face huge challenges because they either don't have a park nearby or there's a lack of transit options to parks and trails. And so many people might say like, oh, that's extra, like transit to parks and trails is not essential. However, the fact that people within communities say that is because often we're used to having everything be a compromise. Everything, we can't get to two places. We can only get to one or the other. We have to choose between work and school and home or parks. And that's just not right. That's just not fair. So again, we need political will and dedicated funding streams in perpetuity to begin to create better quality of life for people here in LA. I just to end kind of on a personal note, I was born here in LA in Echo Park to be exact. And so shout out to Echo Park. And it was a much different community. There were the population was different. It hadn't gone through all the gentrification it's gone through now, but that neighborhood is home to one of LA's most iconic, beautiful parks. And with a beautiful lake, and it's a shame, we talk about park access and barriers. There are many. We can talk about this for hours, but it's a shame that agencies like LAPD, they actively create barriers for people to enjoy that park. It's a shame that generations of kids, and adults, and as they age, will have access to this one place, but they'll have to settle for a man-made lake. They won't a man-made lake that they can't even get into, number one, because they're criminalized for it. And so I just hope that instead of having our youth grow in a place where they're experiencing concrete trails, they're instead able to enjoy the beauty of the San Gabriel Mountains National Monument and our local public lands and feel the soil, learn about the plants, learn to tap into their relations, respect nature, and continue to be one with the land, the water, and the generations of people who have been and will continue to be stewards of those places in a town where, often people say like anything is possible. You have people here that come to make their dreams come true. Accessing a park shouldn't be that hard. They shouldn't come with so many barriers. So just once again, I want to thank you for allowing me to share with you all. And I appreciate the effort it took to bring this group together.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for your comments. Mr. Chairman, do you have anything before we move on to Megan?
No, I'm good, sir.
Thank you, sir. Megan, please welcome and thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So good morning to those of you joining from the West Coast and good afternoon to those joining from the East Coast. I would like to start by thanking Chairman Grijalva and Representative McEachin, along with their staff and support for this opportunity to speak to the environmental justice movement here in Los Angeles. So again, to introduce myself, my name is Megan Chichester and I'm a program coordinator at Black Women for Wellness, where we are committed to the health and well-being of Black women and girls. And as such, environmental justice is vital in the community as environmental injustices disproportionately impact low-income communities of color. So today I will speak about two issues that we are working to address. So the first is neighborhood oil drilling. And we're part of the STAND Coalition, which stands for Stand Together Against Neighborhood Drilling. And we are a diverse group of environmental justice, public health, and faith-based groups working to protect the community. So I'll start by sharing some background information on the history of neighborhood oil drilling in LA. So LA is the largest urban oil field in the country with thousands of active oil wells in the area. 580,000 people in LA live less than a quarter mile from an active well. And that may sound surprising, but oil drilling is often hidden by using tall fences or structures around the sites to blend them into their surroundings. And again, this disproportionately happens in low income and minority communities. The health and safety risks associated with oil drilling are well documented and are increased for those who live, work, learn, or play near these sites. So that includes homes, schools, places of work, and parks. Extraction sites emit known carcinogens and endocrine disruptors, and studies have shown that they can contribute to health effects such as upper respiratory illnesses like asthma, headaches, nausea, nosebleeds, and an increased risk for cancer. When you consider vulnerable populations like pregnant women and children, these risks are even more concerning. Pregnant women who live near an active oil well are at an increased risk for premature birth and having a high-risk pregnancy. Children are also at risk of developmental issues as toxic chemicals can cause disruptions. And so I also want to take into account current events and how they've contributed to the burden that communities face. So when you consider the wildfires that have been happening in California, the people who live in the areas near oil drilling sites are already at risk, which is then heightened from the smoke that has been emitted from the fires. Another instance, just last week, there was a chemical spill in an abandoned oil field in Compton that led to odor complaints more than 15 miles away from the spill site. And so accidents like this pose a real threat to the surrounding communities by putting people at risk of exposure to chemical toxins, acids, and gases. Now, the second issue that I would like to quickly speak to is about chemical toxins in consumer products. So toxic chemicals in consumer products like beauty products, personal care products, cleaning supplies, and more daily use products pose unnecessary and avoidable health risks to the community. These health risks include asthma, developmental delays, birth defects, reproductive impacts, and cancers. And of the thousands of known chemicals in consumer products, only a small fraction have been tested for human safety. And this research is even more limited in terms of the impact of these chemicals on women of color. Based on the little research that exists, many of the products that are strongly marketed to and used by Black women are rarely examined for toxic health consequences. And in the rare cases that they are, Black hair products have been found to be some of the most toxic beauty products on the market, containing chemicals that are carcinogenic and linked to hormone disorders and reproductive health challenges. Black hair care professionals then are at an increased risk and are experiencing the consequences of the cumulative impact of toxic chemical use from exposures in hair salons and unregulated, untested products. Other risks in addition to hormone disruptors and reproductive health challenges are skin and eye irritations, respiratory disorders, cancer, uterine fibroids, and obesogens, which are a class of chemicals that disrupt the normal flow of one's metabolism. So going back to my point earlier about these kinds of products being strongly marketed to Black women, just last month, Black Women for Wellness issued a press release in regard to Johnson & Johnson's refusal to remove talcum-based baby powder that may be contaminated with asbestos from the global market, even as it ends its sales in North America due to lawsuits over cancer concerns. So Black Men for Wellness is still applying pressure, and over 200 groups from 50 countries have joined us to call on Johnson & Johnson to commit to racial equity and value Black lives by removing the talc baby powder that has been aggressively marketed to women of color.
Yeah.
So now with this information on neighborhood oil drilling and the presence of chemical toxins in consumer products, you may wonder how this is happening. And I've asked myself the same question. A lot of it comes down to little to no regulation and testing. And another issue is lack of awareness. So I hope that my testimony today assists in the spreading of awareness. But supporting the Environmental Justice for All Act supports how this can all change at the federal level, requiring stronger federal regulations that implement health and safety buffers around vulnerable communities, appropriate and thorough labeling, in addition to safety warnings for consumer products, community education and involvement in decision-making, and increased research on these issues is vital for the environmental justice movement. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan, and thank you for illuminating something that I've certainly not had occasion to learn about, which is the challenges that African American cosmetologists are faced with. So thank you for bringing that issue to the fore. Mark, we are awaiting you and your comments, please. You're still on mute.
Sorry about that. Thank you for having me, for opening up this space and having this national conversation, which has been needed and will continue to be needed moving forward. Want to recognize the Tongva peoples whose homelands we build community with and on. And of course, right now, there's a lot of attention on the Cali climate, in particular because of the fires that are impacting, really, if we look at it at a global scale, and really exposing that California isn't immune, right? I think a lot of folks look at California as a haven, as even immune to some of what's been happening at the national level with the president. But the reality is, for our frontline communities, being forced indoors because of air quality isn't new. For many of us, it's actually a daily practice. And this is the realities that we have in East LA, in Southeast LA, in Long Beach, in the San Fernando Valley, in South Central, in the South Bay, in many communities across Los Angeles. And this is a result of the agencies that are supposed to protect our air, supposed to protect our water, are supposed to protect us from toxic substances, who oftentimes are more focused on funding schemes instead of regulation and enforcement. And so what that means is communities like ours have to take it upon ourselves to defend ourselves. And so in many cases, we're the ones that have been doing the work to address enforcement deficiencies, right? And we've done this out of necessity, and we've built these practices over years and over generations, right? And I think that's the opportunity when I look at what we have in front of us to do this in more communities, build this in structured ways, and have some of the financial support from the federal level to be able to do this across the country in places where maybe there isn't this legacy of fighting back. And so, despite a lot of, in particular, efforts from the oil industry, we have been able to move policy at the state level to require minimum production of zero emission trucks for the state of California recently. We've been advancing on indirect source rules where some of the places that attract lots of truck traffic, those facilities, warehouses, rail yards, the ports, they're not held accountable for the pollution that comes from these trucks, even though those trucks wouldn't exist there without those facilities. So we're starting to bring forward solutions for addressing these issues that otherwise are just kind of in the wind, right? And I think one of the big issues that we're also facing in California is just really aggressive tactics of the natural gas industry to insert themselves as a false bridge to zero emissions. And I think this is in particular is an issue because if we allow California to move in this direction, we're going to see this across the country, right? And so I think when we look at this, we look at federal air standards. We look at interstate commerce as places where we get kind of hung up, where the state can say, that's not on us, that's the federal government. And so I think these conversations are really important. And at the federal level, probably one of the most important things that we've been doing is fighting to protect NEPA, right? The National Environmental Protection Act. This is so critical for communities, as oftentimes the only lifeline to defend ourselves from projects that are literally killing us, right? And so I think, again, these conversations allow also for some federal accountability, right? What's being permitted? What federal government bolstering? What do the funding streams look like? And then also, what do the waste streams look like? Here at a local level with the Exide battery facility that, poured 7 million pounds of lead into our communities, they held a huge contract with the military, and they were recycling batteries coming from the military. And so the question is, how are federal batteries coming to an unpermitted facility, right? But at the same time, the federal government has played a role in stepping up to even hold the state accountable. So I think there is no one side. I think for our communities, we're trying to work with whoever we can and use any tool possible to be able to protect our communities. Because at the end of the day, it's an onslaught. We're dealing with COVID, we're dealing with killer cops, we're dealing with catastrophic climate change, and at the same time, trying to rebuild community, right? And oftentimes being now pushed out because of gentrification, which folks may not necessarily recognize as an issue related to these issues we're talking about. But what we're seeing is displacement of historical communities who are now having to move out to areas with harsher climates, with less water, that are more prone to fire. And so what we're really going to see in the years to come is an impact on communities wherever we go. And so again, thank you all for opening up the space, and really excited about the conversation to come.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, very much for your comments as well. This is the segment of the program where we're just going to sort of open it up to have a conversation with the chairman and myself and the panelists. And Mr. Chairman, do you care to start?
No, please do, and maybe afford our colleague Alan if he has any questions that he would like to ask the panelists as well.
Absolutely.
I'll be glad to follow that. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Alan, do you have any questions that you'd like to direct to our panelists?
I'll listen to the questions and then follow up after you and Raul. I'm most concerned about some of the issues that Mark brought up, and recently I've been reading about the ongoing battles that are going on with China shipping in the port of Los Angeles, and the impacts on the community in terms of whether in fact they really did meet their environmental standards. And I just wondered if you wanted, to me, that's such a, as I pointed out when I first started, that is such a potential, contaminant for the entire region, the port area. Although they've made strides, and I really appreciate what they're doing. I've just been recently reading about it, about what's going on with China shipping, and wanted to know if he could help me at all on that issue.
Yeah, definitely. I can provide some feedback on that. Thank you for raising that. It's remarkable how for many years China shipping was really held up, and for those who may not know, China shipping is a port terminal in the port of Los Angeles, where the local communities really pushed back and said, hey, this is going to cause a lot of harm. And in conversation with the port of Los Angeles, with the city of Los Angeles, with China shipping, came to some community benefit agreement, right? And some of this included standards, also legally, through legal action, standards of emissions. And so what we what we found out years later is what was being lifted up as a model for how these things should move forward. In fact, the city government at that point, under the leadership of Antonio Viragosa, had communicated to China Shipping that they didn't need to meet those emission standards. That because the economy had gone into a kind of a spiral in 2008, that it was more of a priority to keep China Shipping running, and you know, the emission standards weren't going to be enforced, right? And so we had these years of these agreements that had been sent out being violated, and we didn't find out until after the fact, right? And there's been a lot of, we've been in a lot of meetings, you know, with the Port of Los Angeles, and there's always turnover, right? And so there's some folks who are still around from that time, there's new folks, and they say, wow, it isn't as bad as it could have been. And our response is, but it wasn't as good as you agreed to, right? And so I think, again, in this case, it really takes communities who understand the issues and who have been part of the longer struggle with these issues to kind of bring back and hold accountable these matters. And so I think there are opportunities moving forward to kind of reset agreements, standards, emissions, and mitigate the harm that was caused, because this isn't just about the aesthetic. Can we see the downtown skyline? This is about health. This is about harm to people's health. This is about the decrease in life expectancy. And so these things need to be contended with.
You know, I think there are a couple of issues I wanted to raise. One is, and one comment on that, the fact that exemptions were given and no one was told about it. That's really what, here we can work on doing legislation, agreements were made, everybody shook hands and said, this is going to be a major movement forward. And yet behind the scenes, exemptions were given and nobody was told for years and years about it. So that we really need to address. That is such a large issue. And the next issue is the fact that, you know, talking about COVID-19, I live in Long Beach, and I'm kind of halfway between, I'm right near the downtown, but halfway between the more affluent east side of town and the west side of town, which borders up to the port complex in there. And I think the shock, and it's only maybe, Long Beach is maybe 4 or 5 miles we're talking about in width, maybe 11 miles north-south, but 500,000 people live there, highly concentrated, large port area city. And so on one side of the city, 2.5 miles from my house, and then the other side is also 2.5 miles from my house, the life expectancy on the near the port complex and where the freeways are and where all the trains come in and out of the port, the thousands, and where all the 40 to 50,000 truck trips a day go through, we're talking, is somewhere around 69 years. And as you go 4 miles away, it's 86 years life expectancy at birth. We're talking about a 17-year difference within 4. That data shook me up. I was, not only are the numbers of COVID-19 far greater on the west side than the east side, but the life expectancy. And I don't have any way to kind of comprehend and put that all together, except to share that with you and say, this is mind-boggling. Then, and to hear at the same time, we're passing agreements to make the quality of life and the air quality better. And nobody knows that the exemptions are given on that. So when you put all this together, it's amazing. It is literally amazing. And I just share that with you.
Well, thank you, Alan, and thank you for your concern as well as your advocacy for your constituents who are faced with that dilemma. Yvette, I wanted to turn to you for a moment. It's interesting to hear you talk about the green spaces. You know, I'm here in Richmond, Virginia, and our mayor just announced that he's going to allocate enough land for about 5 new park areas. And I'm wondering, do you have any thoughts that you can, any suggestions that you might give us in terms of guidance as to things to avoid, things to look out for, things to be concerned with as we here in Richmond begin that process of trying to expand our green space? And he is doing it correctly. He's doing it in brown and black areas, areas that have historically been redlined, areas that are really, in many ways, are hot spots. I don't mean in terms of the internet, I mean in terms of heat um, and heat absorption areas in our city. So do you have any thoughts of things that we need to be thinking about here in Richmond as we begin that process?
Yeah, definitely. And this is the time to think about it, right? At the beginning. So often communities are reached out to way down the line, like when the project's already been envisioned and there's renderings, right? And so my advice is that, you know, the community, so long as they, you know, if they feel that these spaces will be an asset for them, come together, and the agencies, along with elected officials, organizations, really push for an inclusive, transparent process from the jump, from the beginning. A lot of public information, you know, one of the challenges we face in LA around access to, you know, public processes comes with, you know, along the lines of, you know, translation, you know, so making sure that from the get-go, as the decision has been made to bring these resources into the community, making sure there is a very thorough community engagement process from the beginning all the way into the end, and that these parks are really spaces that the community designs, that they can decide what features go into them, that they really take pride of ownership over these spaces, and that they're, you know, that they really do meet their needs. I think that once you bring people over together over a communal space like a park, the ideas just start to flow on their own. You know, communities already know what they want, they know what they need. So it's just a matter of engaging them from the beginning.
Thank you for your guidance. I was on mute there for a moment. Mr. Chairman, I'll turn to you again.
Thank you. And that's for my question, Mr. McEachin, is for all the panelists. The nexus, for the bill and for everything that we're talking about in terms of frontline communities, EJ communities, has to do with the intersection that is now, because of the pandemic, light has been shed on that across the country. Many things that all of you that work on issues in those communities already knew, and that is the issue of public health, environmental justice issues, and how they intersect in a very powerful way. The pre-existing conditions that affected Black and Brown communities, indigenous communities, and tribal lands across this country have been graphically shown to the world and to our country, and those disparities. And those pre-existing conditions were there before the pandemic, and the issue of environmental justice and pollution has been there before the pandemic. Now we have now the opportunity is before us about what do you do about it long term. So talk a little bit about that nexus, that intersection between public health, the health of people in those communities, and the policies and decisions that are made around siting, et cetera, which is for industry and the pollution question in general. It's open to all three of you, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I can start. I think there are incredible connections here. These are all intersectional issues when you think about public health, environmental justice, and systemic racism. And I think at the end of the day, it is a systemic issue. And so when you think about the long term, how you go about these issues, you consider a lot of the pollution, public health, access to parks are issues that existed that have only been exacerbated by the pandemic right now. So I think in terms of thinking long-term, you want to have that momentum going into November in these elections, and not only for presidents, but for those local elections, local officials that are speaking for by the people of their communities, and you want them to represent your interests. So I think, again, it's bringing their attention, local officials, to these issues, and having them speak on your behalf to bring that up, but really involving the community in that change.
Yeah, I can jump in next. I think along with that, and one of the key features is some of the investments in communities, right? Because I think we need to build capacity of residents who, again, are going to be the first to spot an issue, the first to smell an issue, to taste an issue, and are going to be the first to feel the impacts, right? And I think oftentimes a lot of these issues are normalized, right? So folks are made to believe that it's okay for your everyday surroundings to kill you, right? To lead to an early death. And so a lot of the work is kind of breaking through that and saying this isn't normal, it's been normalized, and we need to change these conditions. And so I think regardless of policies, right, regardless of agencies, regardless even of elected officials, and many times it really takes community cohesion and community context and community capacity to move these issues. And so I think the investments in community are always going to be something that is essential to any of this.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I mean, echoing what Megan and Mark said, you know, this is all about public health, right? This is all about the health of communities. And for too long, or ever since communities existed, we know who's been planned with and who hasn't. And so it's really important to keep transparency and public processes inclusive, and keep, you know, health at the center of all of this. I just, you know, you know, there's a real lack of empathy and awareness on behalf of a lot of, you know, officials, and people in other communities that just, you know, it's easy for them to kind of turn an eye to what's really going on in these places in LA. So yeah, just wanted to share that.
Well, thank you
Teacher,
all
could I
for
do
those.
Can I
Please,
do a
Mr.
quick
Chairman.
follow-up?
Please.
Can I do it? Yeah. Thank you. Another point that came up as part of the discussion about local officials and national officials, you know, the EJ for All bill is generated by affected communities and affected people. And Mr. McEachin and I putting that at the forefront of any consideration. But as we go forward with this at a national level, and you've seen it at a local level, industry and other interests push back really hard on any regulatory move, any disclosure, transparency move, any seeding in terms of funding for community education and activity, and I think that's going to be we're going to see that pretty soon. I just wanted to get from you your perspective as to how you've seen that, and to some extent how you deal with it, because you know, when you're fighting the petrochemical pollution in Louisiana, you're fighting the biggest donors to individuals and a huge tax base for the state. So there's always a pushback. When you're trying to transition away from some of the polluting activities that are hurting communities, you're going to get that pushback from that industry. So how do you deal with that? And I think disclosure and transparency is an important way, but beyond that, whatever reactions you have from your experiences working in those neighborhoods and communities that you work in, to the question of the pushback and the influence of those that have a stake in keeping things as is.
I can jump in here. I think, I mean, something that's fresh on my mind right now is Exide. And I think a lot of times these companies are able to invest in experts to get them out of accountability, right? And sometimes that includes investment in elected officials as well. And so what we've seen with Exide now is they've gone into bankruptcy to evade the economic impact of having to clean up our communities, and also have seemingly applied pressure at the federal level. And this is Trump's appointees who are allowing them to escape prosecution because they have an agreement that timeline wise the bankruptcy is coming before the end of this agreement for cleanup and prosecution. And so the state actually appealed to kind of the federal agents to come through and remove the agreement, and that was denied, right? And so I think a lot of times we see an influence, and of course here in California, big oil, right, big natural gas, all the petroleum industries just have such a huge influence. And the reality is that oftentimes it's by building grassroots, community-based, massive support for initiatives and accountability are oftentimes the only way we're able to move, right? And that oftentimes relies on the willingness of elected officials to act in principled ways. And too many times that we're finding elected officials who don't, right? Who will fall to the influence of these industries. And so at the end of the day, I think it really is important to have that mass community support that will continue to shed the light, because often what is allowed to happen behind closed doors never comes to light. But if we have that community power to shed that light, that's where we're able to find the points where we stop this from moving forward, the business as usual.
Thank you, Mr. McEachin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Megan, you were making some comments about the oil wells in South Central LA, which is just mind-boggling to me. I mean, I'm here on the East Coast, and you've got to look long and far before you find an oil well anywhere near a populated city. So help me understand what's going on in LA to arrest that, to stop that from continuing, or is there anything going on? Can you shed some more light for me in that regard?
Mute myself. Yeah, so in terms of what's going on, I think it's spreading awareness around the issue again, and kind of getting the community to organize, strategize, and mobilize around these issues. And so that's what this coalition is about. So, spreading awareness around where you can actually locate where oil drilling is happening near you. So maps, just to be more aware, contacting local officials about the issues, and then again, reporting air quality concerns. And those are all things with public records on that. So making sure that people feel empowered to have that knowledge and understanding, and to organize with other members of the community to speak to elected officials to act on it.
Again, for my edification, is it a situation where these pumps have been, or these oil wells have been in existence for a while, or are they doing new drilling as well?
Most have been existing for a while, but some are still coming up. And then the issue of old abandoned oil wells, which again have spills like what happened in Compton. So what happens once they've been abandoned? Who's accountable? What's the regulation around that as well?
Don,
Alan?
to respond to that, in the 1920s, the largest oil field in the continental United States was found in the Los Angeles, Long Beach area. And entire cities were created at that time to avoid having to pay taxes having to fund schools to just promote oil. Signal Hill being an example, right within, surrounded by Long, became a separate city to really run by oil companies in the 1920s and 30s. That's where Getty made all his money. It was through the oil that was here, and that's where tremendous amount. Thousands of oil wells 40 years ago. So that was almost 100 years ago. 40 years ago, when I first came out here, everywhere you looked, there were oil wells. Everywhere. The beach, everywhere. There's been still, it's disproportionate who gets impacted the most. The wealthier areas got rid of all those oil wells. And with slant drilling, if you just left them in the poorer communities, or the communities the less, the ones that had less voice in the legislature, they could do the same amount of drilling and do it slantwise, and you wouldn't see the oil rigs in the wealthier communities. And so what's happened is that there are fewer oil drillings. There are very few new ones, but what there is done with new technology and slant drilling and fracking. And so that's really what you see. The technology has developed to allow a greater production, but it also has it differentially impacts certain communities more than others. And I think that too is the environmental justice issue that we're talking about.
Yep. Good one.
Thank you, Alan. It's always illuminating when we go to these communities to have a conversation about EJ, the things that I'll just speaking for myself, the things that I end up learning in this regard. Alan, Mr. Chairman, or any of the panelists, do you all have any comments for each other?
I did want to add one thing now that Alan kind of opened that space. There's a lot of perceptions of what Los Angeles is, but for many of our communities, we've never seen that Los Angeles, right? And so Alan mentioned Signal Hill, and you can go to the hilltop and look out into the basin, and you can see oil drilling on land and in the bay. You can see the extraction, right? You can see the oil pipelines that are going under communities, that go under people's homes, under schools, under parks, over to the refineries. You see the refineries that are massive, right? So you see the oil production. And then you also see the transportation. You see oil from the Amazon coming into the port of Long Beach through their oil terminal, right? You see oil from the Central Valley being trucked in to the area. And then you see the #1 consumption of this fuel, which is, the ships, the trucks, the goods movement. And then on top of that, you see all the chemical production that happens from this extraction, because the quality of oil that's coming from Los Angeles is being often utilized for chemical production. And then you see the industries that use these chemicals that are also contaminating our communities, right? So you see the entire lifeline, and then you see these products, often in the form of plastics, going to the local incinerator, right? And now we're getting it's the same material that's just contaminating us again and again and again. It's like the industry knows how to recycle and reuse what's killing us.
And Mark, I'll just add, and who's working there, right? It's us.
Right.
Our families, right? So keep that in mind too. It's sick.
Along those lines, one of the things that the chairman and I have been pushing along with Mr. Lowenthal is the notion of making sure that as we transition to a green economy, that we give EJ communities the opportunity to get these new clean jobs, these family sustaining jobs. Help me understand, out in your part of the country, what's the most viable renewable source? Is it going to be solar? Is it going to be wind? Is it going to be hydro? What's really conducive for the LA area?
Well, that's a great question, and I keep pushing it. I actually was on the phone the other day with my utility company, Southern California Edison, because on the East Coast, where you are, Donald, we're seeing a great expansion of offshore wind. And we're seeing from Maine down through Virginia and actually North Carolina, beginning to look at and examine the potential of offshore wind, which has great potential. It has issues, there are still environmental issues, but has great potential for production of and removing our reliance on oil and gas, not only for energy, for electricity, but also for heating and other. So we have a different ecology out there. So I asked about that, and they're just studying, and because in the Pacific, it's such a deep water, they would have to have oil and gas, offshore wind would have to be on floating platforms, not on fixed platforms. So it's kind of an interesting thing. We're not sure. But we have here great opportunities, and we do as a tremendous amount of solar and wind really is the great. California is certainly not going to move towards any kind of, in renewable, any kind of nuclear. We've closed almost all our nuclear plants. We have right here still with all the rods remaining in San Onofre, right in, just talking about oil in it. We have a closed nuclear plant right in the middle of the largest urban context, and so that's a very scary thing and so forth. We don't really like using too much hydro because we don't want to dam up our rivers. And so what we try to do is to share along the Pacific, buy renewable in the winter from the north, Washington State, and then in the summers sell them when we have very warm and sunny days, and that sell them renewable from our deserts in there. So I think it's going to be wind, and so some geothermal, probably not too much new hydro. We have some hydro, but not too much, and certainly not nuclear out here. You would never get people to agree to nuclear in California. That's my reading of where we are. But we have great potential, and great potential to use much more photovoltaic, and we have great potential to use not only to have tremendous amount of job development in that area, but also a big critical issue is going to be for us is going to be batteries or storage, energy storage, and that's going to be to keep this, because we have the opportunity to have almost total renewable if we could store some of that energy, and that's going to be the real issue of storage of that energy when we need it.
Well, as you know, the battery technology is getting better each and every day. Let me just share with you all out here, at least, our wind industry is in its fledgling state. Now, the further north you go, the more dynamic the wind business is. But we are really working off of solar right now in terms of our lead renewable. Of course, the challenge with solar is going to be the land that you use up. Whether if you're going to put it on rooftops or you're going to just have solar panels and open lots, that's going to be a concern that you all will eventually have to wrestle with. Here in Virginia, where we have a lot of open land, we still have the challenge that you're using up good farmland that could be producing food and doing other things to be profitable. But the solar industry is coming in, and this is not me trying to be pejorative, but they are coming in an aggressive manner and using up thousands and thousands of acres. And all you have out there are panels out there, and you wonder, is there a better use for the land? Could we be doing something else with the panels? But you all in the unique situation that you find yourself in LA will figure it out, whether it's wind, solar, or something else. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to kick it to you for a moment because we're just about ready to wrap this up. So if you have some.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank the panelists. I think Megan's point, on the issue of maternal health for African-American women is really important. I was reading an article about the person in the article said that we're discovering this persistent anomaly that miscarriage and premature births are occurring during the pandemic among women. But the important point here is that it's occurring among poor people and women of color across and more and more incidences of that. And I think which begs the question that the effect the effect upon us is everywhere. Every region that we've been to, there's been some consistent things, and one of them is the issue of public health. The other issue is the sense that the community's need for transparency and the right to know and have disclosure as to what decisions are being made that's going to affect them. And the other issue has been that transition period in which you seed with resources and the empowerment of community to be able to be legitimate stakeholders of what a transition is going to be. And the last thing I think is that have been consistent is that whether in Arizona, the drought in the arid area and the water contamination and the abandoned mines the industry has left behind for nobody to clean up at this point. And then the issue I think was really good to have that brought up today by Yvette is the issue, how important green space in connection to EJ issues, public health issues is to communities. And I want to thank you for not reinforcing that, and coming and talking in LA was important to us because this is a huge urban metropolitan area, and the millions upon millions of people, and I think that just kind of amplifies the issues that we're trying to deal with the EJ bill. And I thank you, Mr. McEachin, Mr. Lowenthal, and to the panelists, my appreciation. And, Jonathan that's on the line and the rest of the staff, they can send you information if you're so inclined to write us a letter, communication regarding your thoughts on the EJ bill and why you think it's important or what you think about it in general. So thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And
Where
Alan.
we go next? We go next to Houston, right?
I think so.
Yeah.
Down there with many of our good colleagues down there who are fighting the good fight there. Alan, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alan.
Your leadership on natural resources as well as in your community is invaluable, and we appreciate you. To our panelists, we say thank you again. You have certainly educated this legislator, and we appreciate all the hard work that you all are doing in your communities. Megan, I'll just throw out a shameless plug. Tomorrow I'm having a Black maternity roundtable. So if you have some spare time on a Saturday morning, come on in and check us out. We'll be having some things to say in that regard. To all of you all on YouTube and to all of you all on Facebook, thank you for joining us today. I hope that you've learned something and you understand the importance of the notion of environmental justice. Right now in this period, it's not just about the taking down of Confederate statues. It's not just about police reform, as important as those two issues are, but what we are trying to address is 401 years of systematic racism on this continent. And that is what the people are after. That's why they're in the streets. That's why they're protesting and letting their voices be heard. And there's no issue that's more important in that regard than trying to wrestle with the issues surrounding environmental justice. So thank you all again. Thank you for being with us. To the staff, thank you. And you all have a wonderful and prosperous day.